Welcome everyone to our Managing Through Crisis Summer Series presented by Michigan State University's Broad College of Business. My name is Marcie Stowell. I'm one of the Assistant Directors of Executive Development at MSU. Today we're sharing our recommendations for process improvement initiatives in the midst of crisis. Ralph Smith, an industry expert and an instructor at MSU, will present his recommendations for the first 30 minutes, after which I will share your questions with him. So please use the Q&A feature in Zoom to submit your questions throughout the presentation. I will share as many questions as time allows with Ralph as we go. So after we conclude today, we will provide you a link to a recording of the webinar, which will be posted on the Broad YouTube channel. I wanted to mention it's our 11th week in the summer series, and in the beginning I talked a little bit about Zoom and the format we chose. And I just wanted to reiterate or just recover what we had decided in the beginning. We've been sending surveys and many of you are giving us really great feedback that we're taking seriously to both improve how we're offering the series as well as come up with new ideas for topics in the future. This series has upwards of 1,400 registrants depending on the week. So for this, we chose an interaction level that would accommodate that number of people. The goal was we wanted to share very timely recommendations from our instructors and professors as you in the business world try to navigate through these crises that we've all been experiencing since the spring. So the goal was this sharing of knowledge. If you've been in or been interested in some of our other events, you'll find that we choose interaction levels that differ depending on how many people are involved. So like in a business and bagels or a paid program, you will have a lot of interaction, not just those polls that we do in the beginning. We'll do chats and questions and group activities and all sorts of things. But the purpose of this was to share knowledge right away while we were dealing with crisis in a format we felt would accommodate as many people as possible. So that's why we chose what we did here. And we're grateful every week. We see many of you, we see you viewing our playlists, and above all, we're grateful that you're just giving us good feedback on how we can improve and what we can do in the future to continue to work with those in our community. So thank you for that. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. David Freyer. He's the Assistant Dean of Outreach and Engagement for the Broad College of Business. Dr. Freyer, thank you for being here today, and thank you for your support of this summer series.
Well, thank you, Marcie. It's my great pleasure to be here again with everyone, and thank you for all the hard work that you've put into this series. It has been just a tremendous experience, and we're really grateful for the number of people who have been actively participating each week and who've been sending us just really tremendous feedback. I really have three things that I want to do this afternoon before we turn it over to our speaker. First is, again, just to welcome everyone on behalf of Dean Gupta and our entire Broad College team. Thank you for taking time to be with us each week as we cover what we think are relevant and important topics as we try and manage our way through the ongoing crisis. We have very clearly been listening to your feedback, and as we've referenced over the past couple sessions, there were really a number of things that you asked us for. First is, how can I learn more? How can I be more engaged? And what can we continue to do by engaging with you in these short topical sessions? We've covered a little bit about our executive development program portfolio. In fact, today, many of the topics that Ralph Smith is going to cover align very closely with our business process management certificate series, which is an ongoing series of seminars that cover process improvement topics, as well as one specifically, and that is the aligning BPM with strategy, which is really going to closely parallel some of the topics that Ralph's going to cover today. We also have introduced to you the concept of a LinkedIn group to allow you to continue collaboration with our team and with others who've been participating in the summer series. And today I just wanted to mention briefly the fact that we do have a monthly series called Business and Bagels. These are programs that used to be offered face-to-face in our facility, the Henry Center on campus. But as we continue to maneuver our way through the pandemic, we have chosen to offer these sessions via Zoom as a webinar type of setting. They occur each month. There's a very minimal fee to attend, $30. So we'll get you full participation in those sessions. Our next one is going to be on September 22nd. And again, if you find these topics in this series to be of interest, you might find Business and Bagels to be very relevant for you as well. And so without further ado, let me take just a moment to thank Ralph Smith for being here. Ralph is a tremendous instructor. As I said, he teaches in so many of our process improvement programs, has a tremendous background in terms of practical applied knowledge, works with hundreds of organizations, helping them transform and implement these types of processes within their businesses. I think you'll find that he is tremendously experienced and has a lot of practical guidance and experience that I hope he will share with you this afternoon. So Ralph, on behalf of our team, thank you so much for being here, and we look forward to hearing your remarks.
Thanks very much, Dave and Marcie, for the intro. And I'd like to thank everybody for attending. I saw we had around 700 people on the list. I think that's fantastic. So the subject, we got 30 minutes for me to talk, and then I'll start listening to you. But how to realign business process management with changing strategies. I won't give you a long lost history of Ralph because we've only got 30 minutes, but I will say I took over as part of strategic services, the leader of strategic services for Orion about 20 years ago. And I've had the opportunity, everybody in our company cut their teeth on process improvement. So that fusion between process and strategy is where I've spent a good chunk of my career. And I think that's really beneficial to me now with things changing as much as they have in 2020. So hopefully I can share some things with you over the next hour that'll, make it easier for you as you're adapting to as we say, the new normal. So as far as the agenda, a couple of things here. So we'll discuss the changes in the world that have put a premium on business process performance. We'll determine whether it's necessary to redirect your current strategy and the process for making it happen. I'm going to give you an example as we go of an organization that had a strategic plan, and the key themes stayed the same. How we achieve them is different, but the differences brought on by the current global situation were not dramatic enough to force a wholesale change of direction. On the other hand, some industries will have to behave completely differently. So we'll talk about where each category fits, or how you know whether you fit in each category. So key criteria for deciding the appropriate path forward from a business process management perspective. We have a three-step process we go through that I'd like to introduce to you today: eliminate, redesign, and automate. Basically what we're saying there is, we think one of the key questions you need to ask is, before I try to decide if I need to make something better, let me think about whether I should be doing it at all. Because a lot of times we've seen people optimize things that are obsolete, and there's no benefit in doing things that are obsolete better and faster. So when resource constraints are such a premium, it is important to follow that sequence: eliminate, redesign, and automate. So we'll talk about that. And I'll give you an example of each as we go through, things you might look for so you know what your proper path forward should be. And hopefully with that, the ultimate objective, I'd hate for you to leave after an hour going, interesting, but now I got to get back to work. So hopefully give you some opportunities that you can identify in your organization to actually get out and use some of this stuff. So that's the agenda. As I said, 30 minutes, so skip over the top of some of this, but really important in terms of issues of the day. I've been used to saying some of these for many years, but 2020 has put a new premium on it. So competition's more global versus local, and right, because of that, there's rising customer expectations. So if you're in Lansing and, we were to flash back in time 30, 40 years, your competition would be other companies in Lansing, or maybe stretch as far as the rest of Michigan. Today, things are totally different. You don't have to just be the best in your area in a lot of cases. You got to be the best in the world. And that has led to rising customer expectations. Another thing that has happened in recent years is a continued migration towards self-service types of processes. In the past, that's been a gradual, I'd say an evolution for many years, but we're approaching revolution phase right now. And why is that? Well, technology keeps getting more and more prevalent in terms of business processes. So it has been an enabler that has really forced all those trends at the top over the course of time when it's adapted properly. Now, one of the dichotomies, or one of the problems we see at Orion is a lot of times technology is fantastic, it's out there, but it's not adapted properly because internal processes aren't evolving fast enough. So, there's an old statement that Bill Gates made the quote one time that if you apply technology to an efficient process, you'll magnify the efficiency, but if you apply it to an inefficient process, you magnify the inefficiency. So internal processes have not always kept up, and a lot of times technology has given us the capability of making bad processes go faster. Now, if I were to teach a public seminar with this content 10 years ago, I might have said something similar to each of these 5 things. But the game changer has been COVID-19. It's forced us to think and operate in ways in which it might have been optional, where adapting might have been optional in the past. Now it's mandatory. Now, it was interesting to me. I just happened to be on LinkedIn one afternoon, and they had an impromptu session with Mark Cuban. He was just sitting there in jeans and a t-shirt, and he came on to answer people's questions. And he was talking about the world situation. And I still remember one of the comments he said. I'm actually start with the second one here. He made the comment that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, we'll all be talking about the companies that were born, the global game-changing companies that were born in the pandemic of 2020. Okay, and I still remember listening to the first part of his presentation, his discussion that day, and thinking, that's easy for a multi-billionaire to say. Somebody that doesn't have to worry about whether the doors are going to be open tomorrow or not. But he followed up that conversation with, however, in the short term, you got to do what you got to do. He gave a couple examples of, he was saying, if you own a restaurant that has a bar and the bartender has an idea that says, let's give away $400 worth or $500 worth of drink coupons for $400 in cash right now and stuff like that. But the point was, he was saying it's so important now. Obviously, you got to keep the doors open. So the short-term survival tactics, you've got to spend a certain amount of attention on that. But for those that have the foresight and the opportunity to think ahead, this is the time, he was saying, that an entrepreneur, it's an entrepreneur's paradise if you can force yourself to take the amount of time out of the day-to-day and think about that longer term finish line. And that's really where I would start today in terms of techniques or tools or things to share with you. I was listening to a story once. This one's made the rounds on the internet. You might have heard it, but I think it's a great story and bears repeating. There was a young child, a little girl, 5 years old, wanted to go out for a subdivision swim team. She'd never swam before. So she goes out for the first meet and finished dead last. And she goes out for the second meet and finished dead last. And all the way across the first season, last. The mother's getting a little upset. The other parents are kind of looking at her like, oh, don't worry about it. It's, we're just out here to have fun. Glad she's not my kid, that kind of thing. So 6-year-old season, dead last every time. 2nd-year-old season, every meet, dead last. Comes in for the 8-year-old 4-year-old season. The mother's going crazy. She's trying not to put too much pressure on her, but she takes her aside before the first meet and she says, honey, I want you to do something for me. I'd like you to try really hard to win your race today. And the little girl looks up at her and her eyes got really wide and she goes, this is a race? I thought we were just out here to meet people. That was her interpretation of what a swim meet was supposed to be. And she sat back and thought for a second. She said to her mom, you know, the lanes and all the people cheering make a lot more sense to me now. So this young lady from that day forward turned into a top flight swimmer. She was in running for the state championship when she was in high school. But the point is, at the beginning, she didn't know what race she was running. So one of the challenges I would throw out to you and your organization, make sure you paint a consistent finish line for your organization. Now that all these changes are going around in the world and your strategy might change, sit down and think about what the end result is that you're shooting for. What does success look like? You know, a business example here, I worked with Blue Cross Blue Shield. This was pre-pandemic, but it's a great example. When I sat with the president and his direct reports, they had a vision statement that says, we'll be the premier health plan provider and blah, 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 blah. And I said, okay, so if you become that, what happens 3 years from now? And the first thing out of his mouth was, well, right now we have 8 million members in our health plan. If we succeed in becoming the premier such and such, then 3 years from now, we'll have 15 million members. And right away, half of his leadership team had to be given oxygen because they were sitting there thinking, if we go from 8 to 8.2 in this market, that's a big deal. And here's the boss spouting off about 15. That's a game changer. When you sit and think about it, the path you're going to have to follow or the activities you're going to have to undertake to go from 8 to 8.2 are completely different than what you need to do to go from 8 to 15. So the first thing I would recommend, if you haven't done it already, don't assume everybody has the same idea of what the end game looks like. Sit down and talk about, if we're successful with our strategy and our process performance coming through this, what's going to happen on the back end? Now, just a quick little example. What I typically do when I'm facilitating one of these as part of a strategy exercise, pick an endpoint a certain number of years out, 5 years out, 10 years out, whatever makes sense to your type of business. And then create a bullet point list that articulates what success looks like. Now, there's an example over here on the right. I changed the dates just to make this work, but the topics are particularly relevant. This was from a county government around Washington, D.C., and they were looking 5 years out when they put this together. Now, let's say they had done this in 2018. Well, the first thing, what does success look like? Well, 5 years out, 2023, they said, you know, here's the median housing price in the county, here's the number of residents we'll have, here's the resident satisfaction rate, the unemployment rate, the school system rankings. Those were the things that they brainstormed, that they said, these are the key determinants of success for us. Now, I forced them through coming up with numbers here, not to set numerical targets, but I wanted to see if we had any 8 million versus 15 million types of mental discrepancies there. So in other words, if somebody said 90% and somebody in the room objected and said, no, 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 I think it should be 90.5, that I wouldn't worry about. But if somebody says 90 and someone else says 60, that seems like a fundamentally different situation. So typically what I'll do is get these things down and then talk, you know, that's the finish line. That's the thing that we're shooting for. If your leadership group, well, everybody, but specifically your leadership group is comfortable with that finish line, then you're positioned properly to figure out what you want to do to get there. Now, as I change the things, the dates on here, let's say we had done that in 2018 and we're looking 5 years out at 2023. Well, now all of a sudden, COVID-19 happens. That could dramatically affect what some of our finish line things look like. For example, ugly topic, but unemployment rate, we said 2.5%. So having a discussion now about, is that realistic in the light of everything that's gone on since we came up with it? If not, you need to talk through the implications for that and come up with an adjusted finish line number. Now, going in the other direction, however, we have something here called, excuse me, I lost my thing for a second. Mobility. Mobility, the percentage of roads congested, the definition of that was what percent of our roads can you not go the speed limit at least 75% of the day? Okay, so then it was their goal was 26% by 2023. But with the decreased reliance on mobility, that one might not be aggressive enough anymore, and so forth. But the idea there is the first thing you have to do is make sure you have a consistent understanding or agreement on what the finish line looks like. And then if there's a game-changing type of event, you need to revisit and see if you need to adjust their expectations. But just remember the little girl in the pool. If you don't know that you're running a race, or if you don't know if it's a marathon or a sprint, you're not going to undertake a consistent group of activities to get you where you need to go. So that's point/tool number one. Now, here's an example of an organization that needs to reshape their strategy a little, but they don't need to start from scratch and go in a completely different direction. When I'm face-to-face, I always ask people if they've heard of the Colburn School. Nobody raises their hand. Then I ask if people have heard of Juilliard. Everybody raises their hand, okay? This comes from the Colburn School, which was a competitor of Juilliard. And they wanted to be recognized as a leading performing arts school. Now, this is a strategy map, which is characterized by the overall #1 objective is listed at the top, and everything underneath feeds that, shows how things, these are the things we need to do at different levels to make that work. Now, as you look through this, one of their things says we want to deliver a top quality performing arts education, and we want to optimize our program offering. Well, over there on the right, we still want to do those things, but do we need to change our delivery mechanisms to accomplish that? If you drop down a little bit, we still want to provide a supportive work environment, but do the ways we do that need to change now? They had a lot of instructors, faculty that were in one of the high-risk groups with regard to the virus. So thinking about how to provide a supportive work environment, very different today than it might have been in the past. And so forth and so on. Is the funding situation changed? Do we need to figure out different ways to get visibility? But the point is, they weren't changing enough to where they had to change their map, but the way they were going to execute the key themes that were in the boxes were something that they really had to think through. So that's a situation where you're changing your action items and not changing your overall strategy. On the other hand, if you have to change your strategy, some things that you might need to consider. If you're in an industry that's been dominated by face-to-face interaction, and now the reliance on remote meeting technology has changed your whole delivery model, I can give you the example of my company, Orion. We would travel around on-site, face-to-face, working projects, teaching seminars, and so forth. Now, there's big sections of the country that we can't even visit unless we're prepared to quarantine for 14 days. Completely changed our delivery model. I put MSU up there too, but higher education's the same way. How are we going to allow for the differences in the way we have to operate now versus the way we had to operate before? Sometimes that can be so dramatic, it can change your whole business model. So that's one thing where you might need to change your strategy. Another, if you're in an industry that'll have a completely different customer volume or mix because the new normal will not revert back to the old normal. Now you'll see I've got 2 airlines listed there. My first job was at United. I grew up in the airline industry. And I consult with some different airport authorities and Delta Airlines now. One of the airport authorities I worked with, their passenger traffic's been off 95%. So, if we were to flip a switch and the pandemic was over with tomorrow, would it be better? Sure. Would it get back to the way it was before? Well, one of the things that's happened here is this has forced companies to get in the mode of, What do I really have to travel for, and what can be done online? It's not like it wasn't available before, but without being forced into it, a lot of companies were still in the rhythm of the way they used to do things. Now, this is a Ralph prediction, but I'm guessing that if the pandemic was over tomorrow, then a lot of the business travel that was going on before will remain remote because people are getting comfortable with the new normal now, which means that an organization like Delta, which is predicated on a lot of business travel, might be forced to deal with customers on a Southwest type of level where they're predicated on something else, not a big business traveler airline like the others. Okay, so sometimes the industry will be disrupted and it won't go back to normal. So that's something for you to think about if it applies to your business. New strategy time, if that's the case. And the last one there, if you're in an industry where you need to redirect your entire customer experience strategy. I've had a lot of experience in healthcare, and I picked 2 healthcare organizations there. I've never worked with either one of those. I was just looking for a topic here. UpDocs is one of the leaders in telemedicine. I don't know if they're a leader. That's the first one that comes up on the Google search. But telemedicine has changed the face-to-face interaction model for healthcare. The second one is for physical therapy that's being conducted at someone's home. They come to you. So again, different type of delivery model. So if your organization's business is completely changing, it might not be like right here where we've got, all right, same framework, let's just figure our way around on a lower level. It might be a situation where you say, we need a whole new strategy. Now, the point there is you need to think about it from a big picture level. Strategy usually happens from the senior leaders in the organization. And a lot of times it'll have a process component, it'll have a technology component. Ideally, those will be tied together. Now, it is possible for a strategic plan to say, these are the processes we need to get better at. So the strategy in that case directs the process, which means we have to go innovate and feed that back into the process, and we get better. So that's a situation where strategy drives process. One of the things I'd encourage you to look at is, are there opportunities to close that loop? In other words, are there opportunities in your organization for processes to drive strategy? In other words, there's things that we're so good at, okay, or new capabilities that we've uncovered that are so strong that they can reshape the future of your organization. As an example, H&R Block is known for tax prep, but if you think about the management of the workflow, that's not a consistent flow at a tax firm over the course of the year. A tidal wave of volume builds up to April 15th, and then it goes away. So they had to become really proficient at recruiting, hiring, and training to be able to digest that big wave of activity and teach people how to do things the H&R Block way. Now, once they did that, they would let the people go. So this world-class proficiency, or really strong proficiency at recruiting, hiring, and training actually helped that process drive their strategy. They actually took their proficiency in those process and opened up the capabilities to, a new business segment to do temp services, because that's where recruiting, hiring, and training proficiency can generate a whole new profit center for you. So sometimes now, if you see yourself getting really good at things, when I ask people to tell me something about their processes, it's almost always negative. There's gaps, they're antiquated, they're inefficient, they're redundant, and so forth. Make sure you don't lose the good stuff, because that can help redirect your strategy if you apply properly. All right, so one quick tool here. I got about 8 minutes, it looks like, and then we'll turn over to questions. A quick tool I would leave you with is we're going to work towards what's called a staircase diagram. We worked with a state pension system. They had about 100 in their estimation, what they called major processes. And as we started playing around with it, we came up with some more. We wound up with 144 quote unquote major ones. Now, the reason we were there is they were about to automate, and they wanted to make sure that the processes were in good shape before they did the automation, so they didn't make, magnify the inefficiency. So they had some disconnects with customers. They had duplication of effort. The retirement process was done in 6 different places around the organization, which was unnecessary. So before you automate, figuring out how to combine all those together, wasted time, unnecessary complexity, wasted money, a lot of problems with their processes. We went through a step-by-step where we took those 144 processes and applied some logic to them that we called a staircase diagram, and came out with 63 processes at the end that we're going to go through the looking glass and be in what we called the 2B phase. So those were the candidates for automation. Now, that's a 50% reduction in process count, but process count is as important as the functionality. So we went through discontinuing, combining, and upgrading a lot of different things to go from the begin state to the end state. So the eliminate, automate, redesign is the process that we came up with at Orion to handle this. Now, really quickly, the timing or the sequencing is important. We like to eliminate first. If things have outlived their usefulness, don't think about redesigning or automating them. Get rid of them. After you've gotten rid of some, then look at what you have left and talk about how do you get it ready for 2020. If it was designed in 1997 and it worked then, but it's atrophied over the years, how do we redesign it so it's ready for 2020? And then you consider the automation piece to maximize the value. That's what we call ERA, E-R-A. Now, the elimination part is where the staircase diagram is, so I'll spend the rest of my time here. The purpose is to identify the processes in your organization that have been targeted for termination. So this starts once you know what your finish line looks like. So here's your tie back to the strategy piece. What does the finish line look like? Where are we trying to go? Once you know that, generating a process inventory. In case I forget to say this in a moment, a process inventory as detailed as possible. If you only have 6 mega processes on this, when we start to ask about being discontinued, you're not going to discontinue a mega process unless it's an extremely rare occurrence. But if you can think on a lower level, a more granular level, that's where you're more likely to find things that you're doing that might not make sense and have slipped through the cracks over the years. And then you apply what we call the staircase diagram. Now, as I said, before you ask whether you can do it better, make sure you ask if you should be doing it at all. Some quick examples. This tool helps you target processes for termination and determine the appropriate actions needed to terminate. I'm going to give you 3 examples of processes for termination. At the pension system, contribution review. They had a senior analyst reviewing all of the accounts, pension accounts from their state university, because there was a foul up in the technology at the state university that made every single contribution to every single member inaccurate. It was only a few pennies off in most cases, but it still had to be fixed. So her job was to review all these accounts and make the couple penny adjustments each time so they could make sure they were accurate. Now, the problem there was you got one of your senior people spending a lot of time doing rework and error detection, okay? Huge resource drain. Good idea? Probably not, but they were trying to be customer focused. But here's the thing. The state university fixed their system. So now all the results are coming out right. But in the pension system, that senior person kept analyzing each member's account every pay period, week after week, month after month, year after year. Now, why did she do it? Well, it wasn't job security. It was just because she'd been told to do it, and it never even occurred to her that she would have the authority to terminate or question a process. So that's an example of something that just kind of slips through the cracks for years. So one of the purposes of the staircase diagram is to identify those things and pitch them. Those aren't something that you need to be spending your time on. So part of that 144 down to 63 at the pension system was finding things that had outlived their usefulness just because they weren't relevant anymore. Now, remote counseling sessions. Sometimes you'll do things in your organization that are customer focused and well intended, but especially now in 2020, you've got to ask, is it still worth the cost of administering the process? So for example, in their case, before somebody retires, they have to meet with a counselor. They typically come to Columbus and the counselors meet 10 people a day. But in a rush for customer focus, they decided they were going to have counseling sessions in the big cities around the state. So go set up in a hotel and have people come to them there. Very well intentioned. The problem was they were getting a 40–50% no-show rate when they did that. So in addition to incurring all the cost of the hotel, the travel, and so forth, they were taking some of their best counselors offline for 2 days and only seeing 4 or 5 people when they could see 10 per day in Columbus. Well-intentioned? Yes, but you can't afford it anymore. So now it's time to chop that one out. And the last one, survivor death benefits, just a real quick thing there. That was when somebody died, they would give their survivors $2,500, anywhere from $500 to $2,500, depending on years of service. It started in 1970s to pay for the funeral. Nowadays, it wouldn't even pay for the flowers. They'd never changed the amount. And plus, the $2,500 had to be divided evenly between all the survivors. And so if there were 6 kids and one of them was in Borneo, nobody could get their money until the person from Borneo got back to get theirs. And if this was somebody that only worked there 5 years, I mean, they get $86 a piece. It just didn't make any sense. The point is, that was something that made sense when they put it in place, but it had survived all these years and it was costing them around $7 million just to administer the process. And the benefit was so low anyway, it was almost seen as a negative. So a staircase diagram has a way of isolating all those types of things, so you can clean out the processes that you don't need to be doing before you start redesigning the ones that you do need to be doing. And obviously there's a lot of different tools and techniques out there that help with product process redesign. I'm sure you've seen some of these. We've taught them all at Michigan State on many occasions. So the automation piece, maximizing value. Yes, there's artificial intelligence, there's predictive analytics, there's telecommuting, there's the cloud, there's, you know, the mobility, what can you do from apps and so forth. All of this is great stuff, but where I wanted to leave you with this is make sure you have it in the appropriate sequence. Understand what processes can be chopped out first, understand what redesign you have to do first to make this stuff come alive. Now with that, is technology always the answer? A lot of times it does a lot of good things for you, okay? On the other hand, you know, there's been studies that show a lot of technology projects don't deliver the desired results, okay? So my response is technology a panacea? It depends. See what I did there with the IT? What it depends on is, where's your finish line? How committed are you to really getting there? A lot of times this stuff sounds great when you write it down on a piece of flip chart paper or throw it up on a screen. But when you think about the complexity of actually doing it, it's a challenge. How much money do you have to spend? Obviously a limiting factor. And also take into account the capacity of your IT department. A lot of times we're overloading these folks to the point where it's a constant shuffling of priorities and they can't get a lot of aggressive stuff done. So that brings us to the end. Just some thoughts on takeaways. One of the mistakes that you could make as an organization is assuming that what worked in the past is going to continue to work. So consider whether or not this is a whole different ballgame for your industry. Make sure you have a clear and consistent view of where you want to go as an organization. So understand that finish line. Assess the current processes and get rid of the ones that don't support the new business realities. Use that innovation toolkit I glossed over really briefly to redesign and upgrade your process capability, and then use the latest in technology to get you the maximum process potential. The last thing I'd leave you here with requires a moment of explanation. I don't know if any of you remember the comedy Cheers, but Norm Peterson was the lovable beer drinker that would sit on the end of the bar every night. And one episode, it was a situation where something would happen and everybody would get in an uproar and, oh my gosh, and what are we going to do, and so forth. And all of us, every time Norm would say, hold on a second, is this going to affect the price of beer? And if the answer was no, he'd say, well, then what do we care? So if you need to come up with a more politically correct version of that question for your organization, I think that's fine. But the point I wanted to leave you with there was, make sure people understand the finish line and are working on things that are going to get you to the finish line, instead of working on what they were working on before just because it was their pet project or because they've always done it that way or so forth. Make sure they're working on things that affect the price of beer. Couple of quotes there. Okay, great opportunity. I agree with Mark Cuban. Be the architect of the future, not its victims. And then the last thing there, competition could come from anywhere. This is from Uber Elevate. I didn't even know there was such a thing until I picked up this quote. So a lot of different avenues for competition nowadays. Okay, I feel like I just ran a sprint. Now we've got time for some questions and answers.
And you did the same for us. That's a lot to take in and think about right now. So thank you for sharing all that. My first question is on context. So this is from our experience at MSU and higher education, and I think it directly relates across industries to what others are experiencing as we deal with all these things coming at us right now, as we navigate all these different changes that are derived from the crises that we're facing. So, you know, in higher ed, we've completely changed how we deliver executive education programming. We've not changed the content, but we've changed the delivery of it. So we're not meeting at a location and providing all those services, you know, with food and all of the rest. We're meeting in a virtual setting, trying to create that same collaborative environment where people are learning from each other and learning from the instructors or the professors. So our time has been very focused on converting on-site to live online programs. As we do those conversions, we're discovering a lot of areas where we can innovate in our processes from a strategic and a tactical perspective, but we have just a little bit of time to focus on that right now because our efforts have to be spent converting these programs. So what do you recommend we do now? So speaking, you know, for higher ed, but for all industries, as we're likely facing that same time constraint, what do you recommend we do right now so that we're well positioned to formalize new processes or newly redesigned processes when we have time in the next several months?
Well, I can speak from Orion example on that. Basically, what we did was we sat back and we thought, what are the immediate needs of our customers right now? Okay, the different customer groups, what do they need? And we took each one of our product lines and we said, the premium's got to be on speed right now. You know, somebody's not going to want a 15-year implementation plan, right? What can we realistically do for somebody in, pick a time frame depending on your industry, 3 weeks, 6 weeks, you know, a calendar quarter, whatever it happens to be. And we redesigned all of our, I don't want to throw terminology at you here, value proposition, service lines, course topics, or whatever it is, to how can we get somebody that quick hitter that'll help them take the next step, okay? So some version of that, right? How do we help people make that turn that they intuitively know they need to make, but they're freaked out about all the things that are going on that are kind of getting in the way? Fair enough?
Yeah, that's fair. Okay. And I feel like with some of the enhancements we've made just by nature of having to make them as we converted to remote work and our team dispersed, I feel like there's some gold in there, some things that we've done that will work in the future. So how do you recommend we address those so that we don't lose that strategic shift that's necessary?
Okay, you blanked out right in the middle of that. I heard the beginning and the end, but I didn't get the meat.
That's part of it. You have to guess the question too.
So sorry about that.
No, I'm sorry. The short version was we've made some changes that will be successful from a strategic perspective in the long term. What do we do now to make sure we continue that inertia and we don't forget or miss refining those so that we do have good strategic change?
You know, part of me goes back to the Cuban thing of make sure you spend equal parts, making sure you can get through the short term and get in the long term. You know, again, from personal experience, this has made us better because, you know, we're in a similar business, Marcie, you know, when we talk about training, but, you know, when I'm sitting there, let me look and see here, we've got a couple hundred people online here. If we were all in one of the auditorium style classes at MSU and I can see you and I'm talking to you and we have two-way conversation, that's one level of instruction. Level 2 is where we're going to do something like this, where I'm talking to you online. And then level 3 is where we have something off the shelf that you can just go and pick up. And there's a lot of differences within that. I feel like the process of converting our product line that way has really highlighted a couple of things that we've kind of, I'd call them latent strengths, things we were good at, but we never really realized it, you know? So I think the most important thing as you go through this, don't compare yourself to perfect. Compare yourself to the others that are in your industry or similar industries. If you're better than they are, you're the best. So if you compare yourself to perfect, you might fail to take advantage of some type of strategic advantages there that you just don't see. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Sure.
This question is about overall strategy and process management. So in many cases, processes are managed at an operational level and strategies are developed much higher in the organization. What do you do when the process goals and the organizational strategies do not align, especially when you cannot influence the senior leadership team?
I won't tell you the first thing I said because my first thought was, you know, that's definitely a leadership problem. You know, I heard a great speech once where the speaker said that the job of senior leaders is not to manage actions, it's to manage interactions, okay? And the biggest value you're going to get out of processes, generally speaking, are the cross-functional ones, okay? So senior leaders don't need to be the experts in the intricate details of every process. They wouldn't have time to if they wanted to. But they do have to understand the interactions, okay? How the different pieces of the organizations fit together and how processes flow across them. Okay, now, if you've got that, then the advice I would give you is make sure that all your process work takes up as little time for the senior leaders as you need. You know, if they need to sign something off or they need to do it all yourself and show it to them for approval. Okay, but if you have a situation where they're actively going in one direction, where the operational folks are actively going in another, that's a pretty serious problem, pandemic or not, you know? So I would have to ask the question in that case, is it because our processes are misdirected, or is it because the leadership doesn't understand the operational realities of the business? If it's that second thing, that's a big problem. You know, my mentor in consulting, she gave a speech one time to a leadership group where she said, if you were starting a basketball team, you could teach somebody how to dribble better or pass better, but you can't teach someone to be tall. Okay, either they're tall or they're not tall, and that's what they have when they walk on the floor. Now, you know, she went on to say a lot of times when she gets involved with organizational strategy, she interacts with some 5'2" people trying to play in the NBA, meaning folks that are just totally overmatched by their positions. Now, I'm not talking about not trained. I just mean they don't have it. Okay, so if that's the situation that's causing the disconnect, I often say, if you give a good manager tools, they'll become a great manager. If you give a bad manager tools, they'll become a bad manager with tools. Okay, so that's the situation.
And on that same lines, talking about people, their knowledge and skills, how does that fit into creating a new process?
Well, I think that you do have to have a certain amount of process improvement expertise inside the organization or attached to the project or whatever it happens to be. Somebody that knows, there's 172 different types of flowcharts. So being able to pick the right one that's going to, and the best one, by the way, is the one that makes the point you need to make. Okay, the one that people are going to look at and say, this is going to answer the question for me, or this is highlights the problem we were trying to figure out, or whatever. So, you need to have a certain amount of that. But the more important thing by far is the subject matter expertise over the whole process. If it's a cross-functional thing, one of the big mistakes we see regularly is people that only know their piece of it or are trying to optimize their piece of it. And, I use the analogy sometimes, if you look at automobiles, if the Rolls Royce is the most comfortable, so you get the interior, and then the Ferrari is the fastest, so you get their engine, and you take the best, the Volvo's the safest, so you take their safety systems. If you take the best of everything and put it together, you're not going to have the perfect car because the pieces aren't going to fit. They're all set up for different things, right? Same thing with processes. If everybody's trying to optimize their little piece of it, there's no guarantee that that optimizes the whole thing because the pieces won't fit together. So you've got to have collective knowledge of the whole process and what it's trying to accomplish first.
So let's talk about this process. We've lived through this time where we had to make a couple really quick changes. A lot of industries had to do that same thing. What could we have done differently, or what can we do into the future to create a process framework that enables responsiveness and agility?
Well, first things first, I'm sounding like a broken record here, but make sure you understand your finish line. Now, I went really, today this was the drinking through the fire hose presentation where I did a whole day's worth of stuff in 30 minutes, right? But make sure you have the same idea of where we're trying to go with this, okay? Now, one of the steps I left out of the staircase diagram, a lot of times we'll build what we call an enterprise model of processes. Just didn't have time to cover it in here. But basically, that's just kind of a high-level flow of how, not every process in the organization, because you probably got tens of thousands, but the big ones, kind of how they fit together and how it flows from one half part of the organization to the other. So if you have that kind of understanding first, then you've got you've got the framework established where you can redirect your direct your resources to the specific weak spots that you need to strengthen.
You talked about process elimination, redesign, and then eventually automation.
Mm-hmm.
When people hear that in an organization, at least from what I've seen and what this viewer is also asking, it's a little unsettling, and people are a very important asset to an organization. So what tips do you have to help people continue to feel fully involved when they hear about process elimination specifically and automation?
Well, a lot of that is up to the senior leaders. I see one of the questions on here is also, can you address how you've seen conflict managed during elimination? Okay, I mean, it's a very similar question. How do you deal with that? I'm working with an association right now that has a big research component. And the researchers are really intelligent, world-renowned people. But up until now, they've basically done research on whatever their pet project happens to be. But as an organization, they're changing their strategy to literally redefine their industry. And, it's a big deal. It's a 10-year plan. It's fantastic. But it's going to require the research people to get out of the lab and interact with customers and really bring their expertise to what problems are happening on the front lines instead of in the laboratory, okay? And everybody expects that they're going to have to be dragged kicking and screaming into this. This is not something that they're going to look forward to. All right. So, how do you address that? Well, the first thing and the most important thing is to have a CEO who can appreciate and understand the problem and what these folks are being asked to do. And in this particular case, they've got one of the best CEOs I've ever seen. He's the one that actually brought it up at first before we started the strategic plan. And then I heard it over and over and over again from the researchers. So, the best thing you can do in terms of managing conflict is make sure the leaders get out in front of it. If you've ever watched a lawyer show on TV, if a lawyer has something that's detrimental to their case, they always bring it up first. Okay, they never let the other lawyer bring it up first, because then it's going to sound like, first of all, I was surprised by it, and it sounds a lot worse than it really is, because they're going to spin it in their direction. So you got to have the leaders get right out in front of this. Elimination does or does not mean people are going to lose their jobs. Leaders got to respond to that, because if they don't, then everybody's going to think it does. They're going to assume the worst, right? So that's the thing that I would say is the key thing. Have the leaders out in front.
Okay, and if you were the lawyer, so you would bring up not losing jobs, right? That there's stability. What are other mistakes or things that you would need to bring up in that type of a scenario when organizations are trying to align strategy and process?
Here's the thing. Backing up a little bit, what if people are going to lose their jobs? The leaders have to address that possibility. That's the thing, and if it's a situation where, look, if we don't get better at this, we're all out of here, that's something that people need to have explained. In addition to that, the standard stuff about dealing with change, make sure people are involved in it as much as possible. There's an old change management saying, people don't resist change, they resist being changed. Okay. Mm-hmm. So making sure that people understand, we need your expertise still. I worked with a company once that was in the settling of claims. One of the changes that they were making was going to force them from negotiation skills into electronic subrogation, which means more of a technology focused type thing. And it immediately caused a lot of paranoia. But they were going to need a lot of just, same volume of skills potentially from an electronic perspective or a technology perspective. And it wasn't so scary. As soon as people heard that, they're like, well, that's not my thing. Okay. But the communication of, it's not going to be that bad. This is still something you can handle, was something, the communication piece is something to get out in front of as well.
Okay. And then I have one more question, maybe two if we have time. We have just 3 minutes left, but okay. Let's talk about, we've made this change, right? Processes are redesigned, eliminated, newly effective, and more efficient. And now let's talk about, how do we translate this strong process into strategic influence? What are steps you would recommend?
How do we translate the newly revamped process into strategic influence?
Yeah, so let's say we have innovated, we have a new effective process or set of processes, ideally. How do we make that, apply strategic influence?
Yeah, I have a unrealistic view of that one. And the reason why is usually the folks that bring us in are pretty senior. And so when we are assigned the task of revamping processes, it's from the beginning with an eye towards redirect, utilizing them on a big picture level to redefine or redirect the strategy. Okay. One of the things I guess I'd suggest, if there isn't that direct connect up front, would be find the friendly on the leadership team that is going to champion the effort and get that person to explain it to everybody else, as opposed to, a group session or whatever. So it's a kind of a divide and conquer type of thing with that.
Okay, and the last question I have for you is, Is organizational structure, like governance, roles, responsibilities, often considered during the optimization of business processes?
We have a slide where we considered that level 3. Level 1 is kind of process refinement type stuff. Level 2 in the old days was called re-engineering, which, breaking down the barriers between departments. And then level 3 was more of a process-oriented organizational design. A lot of times you have to do that because when you redesign a process aggressively, you might go from 8 people and 8 separate functions involved in a process to only 3 people with functions that span more cross-functional cross silos, whatever, in the new way to do it. Then you get the situation where you go, well, who are these people going to report to? It doesn't fit anymore. So a lot of times, yes, cross-functional process redesign will drive supposed change or needed changes in the org structure. That's always something you have to be on the lookout for.
Okay. So we had a few questions. You talked about healthcare, manufacturing, a couple examples from finance, and we have people from services here too. From my perspective, from what I heard, I hope you're able to translate what you learned today to your industries as well. Much of those principles are the same across all industries. So we're grateful you're here, and we're doing our best to encompass all industries that are represented while we're here. And Ralph, today you gave us much to think about, and some tools that we can go back, and do a little research on or apply in our own different industries. So thank you for all you did to be here today. And for those of you that are watching, as always, thank you for being here. Thank you for your feedback. We're listening and adjusting or adding to what we're doing here. So we very much appreciate that you're communicating with us after these events as well. So thank you for that. And if we see you next week, we certainly hope to. Until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone.